Hi friends, welcome back to another video. Happy Valentine's Day to you all. Since it's Valentine's Day and it's February, the month of love, I feel like I always gravitate towards a good romantic story, and for that reason I decided to film a favorite romance recommendations video for you. As much as I love reading romance, I find it quite difficult to find books that are clean with no spice in them, and I know there are a lot of you who also don't enjoy reading spice, maybe because you're a Christian like me and you're more mindful, or maybe just out of personal preference. Either way, I wanted there to be a video where I recommended you 15 of my personal favorites. I will say there are one or two books on this list that are slightly spicier than a complete spice-free scale, so I'll definitely make sure to flag those when I talk about them. As you can see, I've got 15 books behind me and I'm so excited to share them with you all. I've organized them in order of more cute and light-hearted to more mature, emotional, heart-wrenching love stories. One thing I should also note is that I don't really read very many contemporary romance novels, so you won't be seeing any Emily Henry or Abby Jimenez book recommendations here. I tend to love reading romance as a subplot in a different genre, for instance fantasy. That's my favorite way to consume a good romantic story. But because we have 15 books to talk about, I'm going to stop the intro now, and I hope you have a big cup of tea or something to keep you nice and comfortable because it's going to be a long one. I just had to put my tea on the floor because we don't have any side tables yet, but the very first books that I want to talk to you about are the Snow White with the Red Hair manga volumes. I only own volumes 1 and 2 in my personal collection because I read it via the library, but this series is by Sorata Akiduki. In this manga series, we follow Shirayuki. It's a retelling of Snow White, but Shirayuki is famous for having unusually bright red hair. Unfortunately, she ends up attracting the attention of the very foolish prince of the kingdom, and he simply wants her because she has red hair. So Shirayuki escapes and decides to leave the kingdom behind and tries to find refuge in the neighboring kingdom, where she happens to bump into the prince of that neighboring kingdom. Shirayuki then trains to become the court herbalist, so it's just a wonderful manga and also an anime as well. When I'm in the mood for something really cute and light-hearted and sweet and adorable, I always think of this manga series, and I love playing the episodes of the anime adaptation as well. As the manga develops, you get to see more of Shirayuki's personality shine through. She's so kind and thoughtful, and you also get to see a lot of other characters. They're very, very fun, especially Obi. I really liked Obi. It's a perfect one for cottagecore lovers like me. Shirayuki is a herbalist, so she's making remedies with herbs and tinctures and things like that. So if you're looking for something cozy to uplift your mood with a beautiful, adorable romance in it and wonderful art, then I highly recommend Snow White with the Red Hair. Honestly, I'd love to read more manga and books with this sort of atmosphere, so if you know of any, please let me know. Next up is another manga series, and it's by Mizuho Kusanagi, but that series is Yona of the Dawn. Now this is one of my all-time favorite mangas ever, and it follows Yona, who is the princess, and as the only heir to the kingdom, she has lived a very luxurious and comfortable lifestyle. That is until one day her father, the king, ends up being murdered by somebody Yona trusted, and so her world is completely upended and she has to flee the kingdom for her own safety. As she goes into hiding, she's protected by her loyal friend and guard Hak, and Hak and Yona end up going on an adventure throughout the kingdom as they try to follow this myth that there are dragons, 6 dragons I think, and they've taken human form. They're hoping to find these dragons, and they're hoping that these dragons will protect Yona as well. I absolutely adore this manga series, like I mentioned, and I think the mangaka did an incredible job bringing out the personalities of the 6 different dragons. They're so different from one another and they're so fun to read about as well. My personal favourite favourite was the blue dragon, but Yona and Hak's relationship is to die for. They have such a slow burn, big pining thing going on. The way that I was squealing over all their different interactions is just, it's such a good series. I first came across Yona of the Dawn because of Hannah from A Clockwork Reader, and I know she really recommends it as well, so I'm so thankful to her because I ended up devouring, I think 20 plus volumes from the library, like all in one go a couple of years ago. And I actually don't know where my copy has gone. Obviously, because we're moving, things are all over the place and I couldn't find it. So I really hope it's not gotten lost in the process of moving. Hopefully I'll find it again. But yeah, if you're looking for a manga series that has the best group of friends, gorgeous romance and lots of pining and a true slow burn, then I really recommend this to you. Next up we have The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea by Axio. This is a YA romantasy standalone novel actually, and it's inspired by the Korean myth of the sea god. But we follow a girl called Mina, and Mina lives in a land where the people believe in the sea god, and they believe that because storms are ravaging the land and destroying everything, they believe that the sea god is angry with them and cursing them. So there is this tradition where annually the most beautiful maiden is chosen each year to be sacrificed to the sea god as his potential bride, and the people hope that one day the sea god will meet his true bride and so stop all the storms. So when Mina's brother's beloved is chosen, Mina does everything that she can to help them not go through this tragedy, and she ends up sacrificing herself to the sea god instead. As a result, she travels to the spirit realm under the sea. Now, whilst Mina does end up coming across the sea god, she finds him unfortunately to have fallen into a very deep sleep, and she receives the help from a mysterious man called Shin. He offers to help her wake the sea god up, and so they go off on this huge journey across the spirit realm as they try to wake the sea god. This book is so lyrical and the descriptive writing is so sublime. It's dripping with melancholy, folk-like imagery. It's under the sea, so you can imagine how atmospheric it is. It was marketed as a book that feels like Spirited Away, and I couldn't agree more. I feel like it's a wonderful comparison, especially with all the transcendent imagery and of lesser gods and weird mythical creatures. It's very otherworldly. It feels really eerie at times, like you don't really know where you are. It feels like you're in a dream. So if you wanted to read a very whimsical and magical book that feels a lot like Studio Ghibli but also has a Korean mythological twist to it, then I really recommend this one. Another whimsical love story that I wanted to recommend, but this time is inspired by Regency England fairies, is Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater. Someone needs to keep track of how many times I've mentioned this book on my channel now, but when I was coming up with the books for this list, I just couldn't not recommend this one because it's basically my favourite love story ever. So feel free to skip ahead if you've already heard me talk about this book a lot. But for those of you who don't know about this book, it follows Dora, who when she was younger was cursed by a fairy, and so she ended up with only half her soul. Having only half a soul means that Dora doesn't really feel emotions the same way as other people do, and so that means that she doesn't really feel embarrassed by much, which often leads her to ignoring social propriety unintentionally. However, it's the London season and Dora has to chaperone basically her cousin, who is joining the London season and making her debut into society. But during this trip, Dora ends up being discovered of her condition by the Lord Sorcier Elias Wilder, and so unfolds a story as they try to unveil the mysteries behind her condition, and you meet fairies in Regency England. It's a wonderful, whimsical, romantic and swoon-worthy tale. It has a charming narrative style, so if you loved Bridgerton, you'll absolutely love this book. You all know how much I love this book now, so I couldn't not include it on this list. And I feel like if there was an Ahya's Cottage syllabus, like a must-read list of all of my favourite books, this book would definitely make it onto that list. Next up, we have The Ornithologist's Field Guide to Love by India Houghton. If you love wild, wacky and humorous books, then India Houghton's novels are something you should check out. This book is about two rival ornithologists, Beth and Devon, and they are on a hunt chasing after the most rare magical creature or magical bird specifically in England. The competition is called Bird of the Year, and Beth and Devon end up having to team up together even though they're rivals because the other competitors are ruthless. This book is historical fantasy, but it's been likened to Indiana Jones, but with helicopter parasols and tea as well. So it's an eclectic, eccentric book. I think because I read India Houghton's other book, The Wisteria Society for Lady Scoundrels or something like that, I was prepared for how wild India Houghton's narrative style was, her writing style. And if I hadn't read that book first, I think I might have been taken aback by how much this book doesn't take itself seriously, but it adds to the humor, it adds to the experience. It's a funny book, and the comedic element of this novel is just really entertaining. So I think this is a really fun one, but I do want to mention that this one has slightly more spice in it than the other ones that I've mentioned. Everything that I've mentioned so far is completely free of spice, but this one has slightly more in it from what I remember. Next up on the list is another book that doesn't take itself too seriously, but it's by T. Kingfisher and it's Sword Heart. This is a cozy fantasy and it has that classic T. Kingfisher warmth about it. This one also has a little bit of spice in it, I think. But we follow a woman called Halla who is a housekeeper, and she one day ends up inheriting a huge estate. Unfortunately, she also ends up inheriting the relatives of that estate as well, and these relatives are not happy that she's gotten the big mansion. They go as far as attempted to murder her, so it ends up working out quite well when Halla comes across a sword that is a prison holding an immortal swordsman inside it. The immortal swordsman is called Sarkis, and he, as soon as he is released from the sword, he is duty bound to serve his sword wielder, who is now Halla. So he's fighting for her life as well, and he protects her from these awful relatives. I loved the relationship between Sarkis and Halla, and I just loved seeing them get closer to each other. I loved the tension between them and the pining. This is also another slow burn. I also just really appreciate that T. Kingfisher often writes about characters who are slightly older than you normally typically see in fantasy romance novels. And reading about a slightly older couple falling in love was just so endearing as well. I also didn't expect it to be dual POV, and I love it when a book has multiple perspectives. So I loved being able to see Sarkis falling in love from his perspective with Halla. Oh, it's so romantic. It's humorous and it has that classic T. Kingfisher flair to it, and I feel like this book doesn't get talked about enough. So if you love her other books, her more famous ones like Nettle and Bone perhaps, but you haven't heard of Sword Heart or you haven't read it yet, then I think this is a lovely one to pick up from her backlist as well. Next up we have another series that I've talked about a lot recently, but it's Emily Wild's Encyclopedia of Fairies. This is by Heather Fawcett, and it's a book series that I love recommending during the colder seasons because it takes place in a land called Ljosland, I think. It's a fictional world that Heather Fawcett has created, but it's so snowy and cold and perfect for this time of year just before spring arrives. But the first book, we follow Emily, who is a professor of fairies. She is currently in the middle of putting together the world's first fairy encyclopedia, and for her final entry she wants to go and visit Ljosland and visit the hidden folk of that particular area. However, she isn't very good with making small talk. She's not very good with talking to people in general, so she has a bit of a hard time when she gets there with the villagers. So imagine her frustration when she comes across her rival Wendell Bumblebee, who has not only followed her to Leosland from Cambridge, but he has also captured the hearts of every villager. If you want a slightly cheeky and flirty male protagonist, Wendell is such a gorgeous character to read about. He's so funny and he has so much personality. I feel like his personality really shines through in this book. Wendell and Emily are academic rivals, so that tension there is palpable, and you can clearly see that Emily just doesn't appreciate Wendell being there. This book I reread, and I recently finished reading Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherlands as well, which I did really enjoy, but I didn't love it as much as the first book, although looking back, I think the more that I think about this book, the more that I hold a very fond affection for. So I'm looking forward to picking up book 3 in the series, which I think is the finale. If you love reading about academic rivals to lovers, fairies, if you love slow burn as well, then I really recommend this series. Oh, and also if you like the light academia aesthetic, this is perfect. Following on from that, we have A River Enchanted duology by Rebecca Ross. Rebecca Ross is one of my favourite fantasy romance writers, and this was the first ever book that I read of hers that made me into a huge Rebecca Ross fan. Set on the Isle of Cadence, we follow a young man called Jack Tamerlane who hasn't stepped foot on his home isle in 10 years. He's been studying music on the mainland and he's a very talented musician. But one day he is summoned by Adira, who is not only the heir of the east of the isle, but she's also his childhood enemy. She writes to him asking him to come back home because the young girls of the isle are mysteriously disappearing. Now, Cadence is an isle filled with capricious spirits like fire, earth and water, and because they only respond to a bard's music, Adira hopes that by inviting Jack back to the island, Jack will be able to play and persuade these capricious spirits to return the lost girls. Book 2 is called A Fire Endless, but this duology is one where both the books 1 and 2 are just as strong as each other. And not only do you follow Jack and Adira, you also follow another couple. It's just so utterly romantic and captivating, and Rebecca Ross is so excellent at capturing characters so vividly. I feel like they're so real and raw. The emotions that they go through is so wide and deep, and you can't help but feel so much for everything that these characters go through. And you can imagine how beautiful the atmosphere is set on this isle inspired by the Scottish Isles, and so I had such a lovely time reading this duology. I haven't reread it yet before, so perhaps this year I'll pick these 2 books up again because I miss these characters. Next up on the list we have the only classic that I've included, although now that I think about it there is another one that I wish I included. I might have to create a part 2 to this series because I just have so many wonderful love stories to talk to you all about. But this one here is Jane Austen's Persuasion. Persuasion was one that I was really looking forward to picking up because I think it's a lot of people's favourites, or at least I believe that Captain Wentworth is a lot of people's favourite Jane Austen male character. But in this novel you follow Anne Elliot, who is 27 years old, and at 27 apparently she's no longer considered young as she has no suitable matches. But you quickly find out that Anne was actually engaged to a man called Frederick Wentworth. He was a handsome naval captain, but back then he had no prospect and it wasn't considered right or proper for Anne to marry someone of his station. So she was actually encouraged by her friend to break off the engagement, which she did. But fast forward 8 years later and Anne and Frederick Wentworth bump into each other again, and you get to see them pick up from where they left off. As you can imagine, 8 years is a long time, and the pining between these 2 characters is just you just can't put it down because of it. but having read it, Persuasion has become one of my favourite Jane Austen novels, which is interesting because Northanger Abbey, which is another one of my favourites, was published alongside Persuasion together in one volume, I believe, when it was first published. Anyways, if you want to read a gorgeous classic, a timeless one, then I really recommend Persuasion by Jane Austen. We've only got a couple of books left now, but the next one is Miss Newbury's List by Megan Walker. I read it for the first time last year and it made it to one of my favourite books of 2024. It's about a young woman called Rosalind, and Rosalind is due to be married to the Duke. However, she doesn't love the Duke and she's only met him once or twice. So when she realises that there was a list that she made when she was younger about 10 things that she wanted to complete before she got married, she's determined to complete that list. But then Rosalind meets Charlie, who is her best friend's cousin, and Charlie has come back to the countryside because he is learning to be his father's heir. Now Charlie doesn't have the best reputation, but he volunteers to help Rosalind do all these 10 things and check them all off. And so ensues this journey between the two of them as they fall into a friendship and perhaps more. Not only did Rosalind and Charlie's encounter make me swoon, but it also made me cry, and I feel like a book that makes me cry is always a testament to that fact that the book is really emotional and really, really good. It takes place during Regency England, which only adds to the romance of everything. This book is set during Regency England, which only adds to the romance of everything, and I wanted to include it on this list because I feel like it's a perfect read for spring, and spring is just around the corner, so do get your hands on this one if you'd like to pick it up this coming season. Next up is a book that I don't currently own, but it's another Rebecca Ross book, and it's Divine Rivals. Now I will say I haven't actually gotten around to reading Ruthless Vows, which is book 2 to the duology, so I don't know how the series holds up, but I'm sure it's just as good as book 1 because book 1 made me fall in love with Iris and Roman. This book is a YA fantasy romance, and you follow Iris Winner, who is a journalist, and she's desperate to gain the promotion to be able to work at the Oath Gazette. Meanwhile, there's a war going on, and so Iris sends letters to her brother who is out on the front line fighting during the war. And then there's her rival at work, Roman Kit, who's also a journalist, and the two of them just don't get along. So when Iris's letters fall unexpectedly into Roman's hands, they end up forming a connection through their magical typewriters. I was devastated by the end of this book. I feel like I went through a whirlwind of different emotions, falling in love with the characters. It's also set during a war, so you can imagine that there's a lot of heartbreaking moments throughout it as well. I just think that Rebecca Ross is amazing at crafting characters with romance, where the romance isn't just pure fluff, like there's actual depth behind it. And I feel like that's especially hard when you're writing a YA fantasy romance. So the fact that this is a YA romantasy that has moved me so deeply just goes to show how much I adore this book. The atmosphere in it is very different from A River Enchanted. I'd say A River Enchanted is more like a Scottish folklore kind of atmosphere with really temperamental seas and storms and rain, whereas this one feels more like imagine typewriters and journalists and academics and newspapers. It's a completely different atmosphere, but I love both of them so much equally. I want to pick up Ruthless Vows and finish it, but I'm also nervous to finish it because there was a huge cliffhanger at the end of book 1, so hopefully I love book 2 just as much, but we shall see. We only have 4 books left, but this next one is The Storied Life of A.J. Fikri by Gabrielle Zevin. Gabrielle Zevin also wrote Tomorrow, but this book is one of her older books, I believe. This is one of the only contemporary romance novels that I've included on the list today, but it's one of the first books that I read this year and I gave it 5 stars. I had been wanting to pick this one up for a long time because I'd seen it on a lot of people's absolute favourites and I adored it just as much. It's one of my new favourites. But we follow a rather grumpy bookstore owner called AJ, and AJ's life isn't going the way that he planned for it to go. Not only has he lost his wife, but the bookshop is just not going very well. He's on very low sales right now. So when Amelia, who is a sales rep at Nightly Press, comes with her personality that is full of sunshine, it clashes immediately with AJ's cynical one. So they get off to a very bad start, but Amelia doesn't give up and she's determined to keep coming back to sell these books. And then a mysterious package one day arrives at the bookshop, and this package changes AJ's life forever and gives him a reason and a motivation to try living once more. This book is really humorous and it has a very irreverent tone to it because of AJ's personality, but my goodness, does it pack a punch. It's heartwarming and funny and thoughtful and deeply moving. It talks about love in lots of different ways. It talks about love of books, it talks about love of people and love between people. There's a beautiful and realistic romance in it that it's going to break your heart. So if you're ready to cry some tears, because I definitely did, then grab a box of tissues and grab this book. The storied life of AJ Vickery included, the next 3 final books, I have to give you a warning because these books will all move you to tears. But the next one is Juliet Marilia's Daughter of the Forest. In this book you follow Saoirse, who is the 7th child and the only daughter of the Lord of Seven Waters. But Saoirse lost her mother when she was very little, and she's been doted on ever since by her 6 older brothers and her father as well. So she's lived a very comfortable, beautiful lifestyle so far, until one day things get ugly when her father ends up marrying a new wife, and this new wife happens to be an evil enchantress. She doesn't like Saoirse and her brothers, and so she ends up cursing them, and they are exiled from the land. And in order to break the curse that has been placed upon her brothers, Saoirse's only way of solving it is to remain silent, like completely silent. She's not allowed to speak a word. And so begins her journey as she leaves the comfort and safety of Seven Waters, trying to break this spell. You know, when you read a book that is basically everything that you are looking for, it's very hard to feel the motivation or to feel satisfied after reading anything else after it. And that was exactly how I felt about my experience with Daughter of the Forest. I devoured this book and I adored it so much. I mean, I've tabbed this book like crazy, and when I finished reading it, I basically fell into a reading slump because nothing could compare to how amazing this book was. I love Juliet Marilia's writing style. There's a very creepy, eerie and haunting atmosphere to it, which is very reminiscent of a fairy tale actually. I absolutely love the way that Juliet Marilia describes nature, and she's got a really lyrical way of writing which is so mesmerizing. The relationship that Saoirse has with her older brothers is so special to read about, and I think that was my favorite part of the whole book actually. And she also meets a man who happens to be the lord of a different kingdom or something like that, like an enemy kingdom, but the two of them go on a beautiful love story. I couldn't recommend this book more enough, but I will say if you're planning on picking up, do check out the trigger warnings because Juliet Marilia doesn't shy away from very difficult topics as well. Next, for the penultimate book of the video, we have The Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society by Mary Ann Schaeffer and Annie Barrows. This is one of my all-time favourite historical romance novels, and I don't think I've ever talked about it on my channel before, so I'm really excited to talk to you about it today. It's set just after the Second World War, and you follow a young woman called Juliet Ashton, who is a writer, and she's looking for her next new book subject. But she receives a letter one day from a man that she's never talked to before, and he writes to her saying that he is a resident of Guernsey. He's somehow come across one of her books and she is intrigued by him, so the two of them begin a correspondence via letters. Through these letters, the man introduces Juliet to this society that he belongs to, and it's called the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society. He explains that the society came about during the war when Guernsey was occupied by the Germans. The Germans had set a curfew for the residents, but they were seen breaking the curfew. And so to come up with an explanation as to why they were still out at night, they basically made the society out of thin air of just things they were holding, which was potato peel pie and books. But through it, they had to show the Germans that this society was real, and so began the real members of the society. This is an epistolary novel between Julia and the man as they write to each other about the society, and Julia is intrigued and she goes to visit him. It's such a beautiful story of friendship, of romance, camaraderie, as well as these people have gone through some awful things. It also has a lovely film adaptation if you haven't watched it already, and it has Lily James playing Julia Ashton. It's on Netflix, I think, and I really loved watching that as well. And for the final book of this video, we have Daughter of Rome by Tessa Afshar. Now this final book is a special one because it's written by Tessa Afshar, who writes Christian historical fiction novels. She takes stories from the Bible of real people and presents them in a way that's really accessible for modern day readers to read about, and it's set all during the time that the actual people of the Bible were living in, and she does such a phenomenal job of presenting these people so vividly. I absolutely love and adore every single one of her books, but I think Daughter of Rome is potentially my favorite one, and it's one that I've read multiple times down, and each time it's made me sob my eyes out. But in this book you follow the Bible story of Priscilla and Aquila. Priscilla is the daughter of a very prominent Roman general, whilst Aquila is a Jewish immigrant, and the two of them end up encountering one another, and they have no idea that God is about to use them to be one of the most influential couples in the early church. Priscilla and Aquila overcome their differences as they begin to fall in love with each other, as they begin to see God's love for each other, and it's altogether a very moving story because you are able to see that God uses sinners, God uses people who are imperfect, just like Priscilla and Aquila. He uses these people for his great purposes and he loves them, and you see the characters grow as well. I say characters because they're written in a book, but they were real people in history. It's such a beautifully encouraging book because it reminds you that God uses you and me, who are also imperfect and we are also sinners. You see God's mercy overflow in their lives, and you see that through that love they are able to love one another and be merciful and gracious to each other as well. So whilst this is a Christian romance, you don't have to be a Christian to read and to enjoy it. It's just a stunning book overall, which is why I wanted to include it on this list. Looking at the books, I know that there are so many more that I can even just think of right now off the top of my head that I want to include. I may have to create a part 2 or just create another romance book recommendations for you next Valentine's. I just love a good love story. It's just one of my favorite things to read about. People falling in love. So I hope you really enjoyed today's video. I'm always on the hunt for more beautiful romance books, so please recommend all your favorites in the comments below. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye friends!